Hello, everyone. Welcome to this impromptu live stream. I wasn't planning to go live today, but I had some stuff that I want to talk about, and I just thought I would talk about it live. I'm trying to pull up the video here on my tablet because I just find that's a little easier to keep track of comments and things. Cool. Okay, it seems to be all connected and everything, so we'll get right down into it. So classics versus literature. I think that I've tried to talk about this before on my podcast. So back before I really had a YouTube channel, I was doing this podcast, just audio only, on my blog, and I had an episode called What is a Classic? Kazuo Ishiguro's A Pale View of Hills, episode 18. You can check it out in the archives on my blog. But I kind of went over some different definitions of classics by these different academics and experts and so on. And I was trying to make a case for Ishiguro's novel A Pale View of Hills, which is a very dark horror story written in the 80s, I believe. Talking about, whether that book could be a classic in the future, assuming enough time had passed and people still enjoyed the book. And I linked to a interview that Ishiguro did where he talks about this novel in depth and, some of the historical and social themes that he talks about in the book. Anyway, that's a long intro to say that I've kind of circled back to this topic, and I would say I'm not like, to me, I really struggle to pinpoint the definition of literature because I don't think of it as necessarily having to be stylistically profound, right? I mean, there's obviously authors that are very good at the art of writing as a skill, the way they put words together, the way they use analogy or metaphor, and just name any of the great the authors we think of as great, at least in Western culture, and they probably have a really good style, and use a lot of those literary devices, we call them, right? I'm not someone who necessarily feels like literature has to have that to be a classic, but I kind of want to pick apart those two terms, classic and literature, and how I feel they're not necessarily interchangeable. So what triggered all of this? I've been binge watching this YouTube series called Super Easy, Barely an Inconvenience, Screen Rant Pitch Meetings. What if some of the worst movie-making decisions were made with the best intentions? Step inside the pitch meetings for some famous movies. So what this is, it's this one guy named Ryan George who does these skits where he plays both this greedy movie producer and also a semi-creative screenwriter, and they go back and forth. So the screenwriter pitches his idea for a film. This is real movies. And then the greedy movie producer, he comes back with questions about the plot holes and various things that happen in these films, and the screenwriter has to back up his reasoning or lack thereof. So it's pretty hilarious. Like I said, I've been watching these constantly, and some of them are less, some of them are more tasteful or less tasteful than others, so your mileage may vary there. But most of them are pretty funny. I've really enjoyed the ones for Jurassic Park and Jurassic World in particular, and also movies I haven't seen. Hi, Blush. I'm just doing a really impromptu live stream here, talking about classics and literature and how I think those are two different things. And I think this is something we've talked about too on occasion. And yeah, again, it's not really something I've been able to pinpoint perfectly, so I'm sort of using this YouTube series to help me think through that. And what do I mean by that? Well, so what I learned from watching this is that a lot of movies are actually very, very poorly written. And I noticed that even in movies I'd seen and had critiqued, such as, I think he did Jurassic World: The Fallen Kingdom. Yeah, so this is a really good example of a movie that has lots of plot holes, but it did very well at the box office, and there's going to be further sequels, I believe. So what does that mean in terms of writing and not just commercial success, but whether something becomes a classic? Because he also talks about movies on here that, people would consider classics, but if you really pick them apart, they've either got tons of plot holes or they've completely suspended any sense of reality in order to bring about certain plot twists. That kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, it definitely gives me more confidence in my own writing capabilities, but what does that really mean in terms of books? Because obviously, I mean, with the right technology, you can get away with a lot in film. But that's kind of one of the things that jumped out to me. So, lots of plot holes in famous movies, but also effects, special effects being huge. And not only that, but just, what is the emotional reaction that you're trying to generate from the audience? And it made me think too about something I learned in a training course I took for managers, and the person giving the training course, she said, it's not just about what you say to somebody, but it's the tone of voice that you use when you're saying it. So obviously very easy to see how that applies to films. But I think there's also something to be said for how that applies to literature. So writing style can be a kind of special effect, right? You can read a book that's gorgeously written, but if you really pick it apart, maybe the substance isn't there. And I've certainly read some books like that. I'm not going to call out any specifics, but some books such as by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm trying to think of some other ones here. I mean, some people would even say, more contested books like Moby Dick. Like, now, there's a lot that could be argued while there is substance there, but what I'm getting at is there are definitely books that are very high on style and the substance is ambiguous. Blosh says, I think it's important, just as we make a distinction between literary and genre books, we need to make a difference between movies and cinema. Yeah, that's a good point too. I mean, I was watching, so the best movie I saw recently was a film called A Hidden Life, and I'm trying to remember the name of the person who directed it. But anyway, I can pull that up later, maybe in the description I'll put a link. It was a really stunning film, stunning cinema, but not at all one of these types of blockbuster films. It was very slow, it was like 3 hours long, and it really got into the emotions of all of the characters, and really did a very good job of showing their motivations and the very granular, very nuanced conflicts they came up against from other characters and from the circumstances. So, I get what you're saying there with the difference between movies and cinema. But I would still say you could have a movie that kind of spans both. I'm not exactly a movie critic, but I think a lot of the older movies especially fall into that kind of overlapping category of good film and or good movies and good cinema. Um, so yeah, special effects in a literary sense. So a couple of authors I want to call out that kind of came to mind recently were Nathaniel Hawthorne and Agatha Christie. And maybe I'll just start with Agatha Christie. So the author of famous detective stories series, Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, Tommy and Tuppence. Great series, right? And I recently mentioned her on books that I find addicting. I think that some of her books kind of demonstrate this difference between maybe great literature and great classics. I don't know. I definitely think of her as a genre author because she uses a very formulaic, fairly formulaic plot devices in her books. Excuse me. Some of her books have certainly come to greater level of classicness, if you will, than some of the others. Obviously, most people have heard of Murder on the Orient Express, and Then There Were None was really big, and still is. So why is that, and what's the what causes those books to be, maybe on a list of classics versus some of her other books in the same series? And so I'm just going to leave that thought there and come back to it. I'm going to switch over suddenly to Nathaniel Hawthorne. And, he's always going to show up on the list of American literature, American classics. So here's the deal. I think his greatest novel, so I haven't read The Scarlet Letter yet, which is extremely embarrassing. But I've read pretty much everything else he's written, and I am going to read this, but I just haven't yet. But if we were to look at all the rest of his novels kind of at a glance and his short stories and so forth, I think his greatest piece of writing was The Marble Faun, which pretty much like very few people read. I feel like this is a great work of literature. As it says here, the romance mixes elements of a fable, pastoral, gothic novel, and travel guide. And it features 4 character types, which basically symbolize and live out a retelling of the fall of man from the Genesis narrative in the Bible. So you've got all these layers of cultural references, literary references. 2 of the characters are artists, so you've got some interesting references to art. And when I read it, I was really, really impressed with how beautifully written it was, how very much I connected with the characters, and yet I can see why this book doesn't have the kind of universal interest of some of his others, even, The House of the Seven Gables. I think there's something kind of niche about The Marble Faun, so if you're not into religious history, art history, those kinds of, and then the whole travel guide, right? There's a lot of exposition in this book about Rome in the 1800s, which is amazing, but that's not going to appeal to everybody. So I do think universal appeal is still part of what makes a classic a classic. And I think this is good literature. I think it's not. It's debatable whether it falls into one of those universal classics. And so, yeah, looks like we've got a few more people who joined. Welcome. We're just sort of rambling here about what makes a classic and what makes literature, and sort of peeling apart books that, maybe the literature aspect is very strong, stylistically, or through their use of literary devices. The author has really created a beautiful universe and setting, and tied up all the loose threads and everything. But I think the classic, though, needs to have universal elements and not be one of these niche writings, like I think the Marble Fawn is. This is by Hawthorne. So Agatha Christie, going back to her briefly here, there is the plot of And Then There Were None, if you're not familiar, sorry, there's some bad language on the screen. And Then There Were None was basically, the setup is you've got these characters, this cast of characters, and they're called to this, I can't remember if it's an island or just a house. But anyway, they're all in this one place, and they start dropping off one by one. Very cinematic in itself, and doesn't necessarily set you up with the kinds of character development that other novels may have. It's more, it's meant to feel like you just arrived there, you're just meeting people, and it's more of a horror story than a mystery, really. So I can see where that has pretty universal appeal, because you're not necessarily having to commit to getting immersed in a world, right? It's just, you're at this house and people start dropping off. And then the other book, of course, is The Murder on the Orient Express. And, that's the one where you've got a bunch of seemingly random people on this train, and a very gruesome and mysterious death happens on the train. And again, that's something that's a little more relatable than some of her other stories, where you have to get more immersed in British culture and things that were going on in the early 1900s, culturally, So yeah, I think that it kind of makes sense why those two novels in particular have really distinguished themselves as classics, having a more universal interest in them, and also opening up the door, of course, to some of her other books. Because once you get into that world, even by these more universal-ish novels, you quickly get acclimated, right, to the world of Poirot and Marple, and it's really fun. So, yeah, so, I mean, it's not really anything earth-shattering there. I think the thing is, my big takeaway lately is not to use literature and classics completely interchangeably. I think that you can be one or the other, and sometimes you can be both. Blage asks, by that, do you have any classics you wouldn't consider to be literature, or rather not have that much literary value? Okay, so let me go back to my list here. Let me think about that. That's a really good question. And in part, it is a little difficult to answer, because we have kind of, at least in the West, we've kind of grown up with this canon of classics, right? And so we don't really go into that necessarily with any objectiveness as to what literature is. We're looking at these books as examples, because we've been told that these books are great literature, right? Excuse me. So, man, I really hate to use this as an example, but Ayn Rand, famous for her objectivism philosophy and her books that have sparked various interests and controversies. I've read the one book, Anthem, which was more of a novella. I don't think that her writing is great literature, and we may have talked about this before on another live stream, but I do think her books could be considered classics based on the fact that they've attracted a lot of people from different backgrounds, and that they've broken some ground in a certain sense, that they've come to represent something in terms of a particular outlook, right? A particular worldview that does resonate with a lot of people, whether you like it or not. So I think she's a good example of something that could be considered a classic, but not literature. Let's see. A lot of these Boy's Own so-called authors like Stevenson. Boy's Own was it was a periodical that came out in the 1800s that had stories for boys, and so any of these books that feature boys as the characters used to be written off as Boy's Own stories, right? And those, a lot of people would say, well, that's not great literature. I would kind of disagree with that, but I mean, it could be argued that those are classics because a lot of people can relate to that coming of age narrative, but not necessarily, elaborately great writing. But I would kind of argue against that. I think that the character development in, say, Kidnapped is some of the most excellent I've ever read, and shows a great deal more talent than just formulaic genre writing. Let's see. Blage says, I don't think Charles Dickens has that much literary value. He was important for the evolution of a thriller. That's interesting. That's really interesting. I have to say that, I don't look at Dickens as someone who had an extraordinary writing style. Everyone loves his characters. And yeah, he certainly mastered the art of the character. Though that's a really, that's a very controversial opinion. Interesting. I'll have to think about that one a bit, for sure. The Red Badge of Courage. I didn't care for the Red Badge of Courage because he was developing something really interesting in the first part of the book, which was the protagonist's aversion to war, but he never really, he didn't flesh that out to any kind of satisfactory conclusion. And maybe there's some realism to that, but I would say maybe that's a good example. It's one of the few books that I know of that kind of covers that story of somebody, having these doubts. But it to me, it didn't really, I don't know. I'm not sure if I would call it a classic either. But I understand why someone would consider it to be a classic. And the other thing that makes this very difficult is that we have this, I guess, false idea that just because something's old, it's somehow better written. That's not necessarily true. Okay, I'll give you a really good example here. And I think I've talked about this before, but The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte Mary Young was a big blockbuster novel in the Victorian era. And, I did read it several years ago because it was very influential to Louisa May Alcott and many other writers. And honestly, it's kind of lost some of its universal appeal because it's highly religious in nature, and a lot of the plot twists hinge on very specific kinds of religious thinking. And then also, the writing, in my opinion, was not very good at all. It was not clear to me what the conflict was with the antagonist, Philip, the cousin. And it just left me feeling like there was the makings of a really great story, and somehow the pieces just didn't come together for me. So yeah, I mean, for a while that book was certainly, I'm sure many would have said it was a classic, but it has kind of lost its universal appeal, at least among, the original geographical readership, you might say. And then also, I don't think the writing holds up nearly as well as the Brontes, and the Brontes certainly have their flaws. But I do think that their writing holds up better as literature, because they really get into the characters' heads much better, and the conflicts are far clearer. Hi, Joseph. Joseph says, can you share your opinions on George Eliot's literary merit? Yeah, so I have to confess, I don't think I've ever read anything by George Eliot except I did read Silas Marner many years ago. So I'm most familiar with her stories from various adaptations. So I've watched adaptations of Daniel Deronda, Middlemarch, and I think there might have been one more. Of course, Silas Marner as well. So it's definitely on my list. Especially I want to read Middlemarch because I was really impressed with the story, even just from the costume adaptation. I think there was a lot of depth to the characters, and I'm curious how that comes across in writing. So yeah, I can't really say yet, but I know there's a lot of depth there for sure. Hi, Marios. Marios says, Why We Read the Classics by Itsalo Calvino was suggested to me by one or two professors in university a while ago. Yeah, I want to say I did read that one when I was doing research for this a couple years ago, but I've since forgotten, to be honest. Or maybe it was somebody else who had blogged about it. I know I read his list at one point. Let me see if I can pull it up here without any issues. Let me pull it up on my tablet. Typing. Okay, so 14 criteria for what makes a classic. And this is from openculture.com. This website says they're giving an abridged version, but basically, here's some of the things that he says. We use the word classics for those books that are treasured by those who have read and loved them, but they are treasured no less by those who have the luck to read them for the first time in the best conditions to enjoy them. Every rereading of a classic is as much a voyage of discovery as the first reading. Every reading of a classic is, in fact, a rereading. A classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say. The classics are the books that come down to us, bearing upon them the traces of readings previous to ours, along with the culture or cultures they have passed through. classic is something that tends to relegate the concerns of the moment to the status of background noise. I couldn't agree with that one necessarily. I've definitely read some worthy classics that I had to really focus very hard on. But yeah, that's an interesting list. The rereading thing in particular, I'm trying to think how I feel about that one, because I would say my favorite books I definitely can read multiple times and get something new from. But I don't know. I mean, there's certainly books that, like, they have a certain punch to them, right? And you get it the first time, and then after that, it's like there's no more surprise. And that's not necessarily a fault of the writing. It really depends what the book is about and what it's trying to say. Certain things can only really be said once, I think. Interesting. It might be good to, maybe I'll do a follow-up on that list and kind of go through it more systematically. That would be a good one to do. So yeah, I didn't really have a lot more for this live stream. If anyone had any questions, let me know. This was just something on my mind and, inspired by these funny YouTube videos. But going back to one thing I did say at the beginning, I think something that also can make a classic is that emotional impact. And that there doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of substance under that. And I think, maybe there's some Dickens novels that could come under that. I'm not saying that they are like that, but it could be argued that a lot of those books, it's the emotions you feel that leave the most lasting impact above and beyond whether the plot made sense or was super logical. I'm really thinking of Little Dorrit, because the ending of Little Dorrit, if you've read it or watched it, is extremely confusing and highly unlikely. But the story, and I read like most of it, but I didn't finish it, so I didn't put it on this list. I did watch the mini-series with Claire Foy and Matthew McFadden. That story packed so much emotion in it. It was the effect it left you with versus, whether it made sense. So I think that's a classic in that regard, because there's something you can relate to, and it just haunts you. And then, the actual plot may leave some things to be desired. Blash says, I think it's the immortality of the idea that can justify the reread. Since you grow as a reader, you can see it from a different angle, even if you are aware of it. Yeah, that's true too. A lot of books, maybe it's not so much that there is anything more in the book left to be learned, but you maturing and growing might pick up on things that you were, that maybe you just didn't even see the first time. That's definitely happened to me. Cool. Well, this was good. I'm gonna call it a day, but thanks for hanging out, and I will probably do a follow-up with Calvino's list at some point. Hope you're all staying safe. We are still at home here in Washington State, and will be for the foreseeable future. So thanks for watching, and see you all very soon.